Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. I always consider myself a man who paid attention to the details. I had to. In marketing, small shifts in perception can make or break a campaign. But it wasn't work that sharpened my senses that day. It was something far more personal, something I should have noticed sooner. It wasn't any one thing, really. It was the way Sarah had been checking her phone more often, her fingers flying across the screen with more intensity than usual. Or maybe it was how her laugh, the one I used to hear every day, had become distant, like she was sharing jokes with someone else in a language I no longer understood. It had started slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a crack in the foundation of our life. Sarah's phone would buzz late at night with vague excuses about work emails or friends in crisis. I didn't question it at first. That's what trust does. It makes you blind to the details that should set off alarms. But it was more than the phone. She'd started spending more time away from home, citing work trips that didn't align with her usual schedule, or plans with friends she barely mentioned anymore. It was all so casual, so well rehearsed, that I felt stupid for even suspecting anything. Still, something gnawed at me. It was like a splinter lodged beneath my skin, small enough to ignore but persistent enough that I couldn't forget it was there. The house felt different too. It wasn't obvious at first, but our conversations over dinner became shorter, the silences more pronounced. When I asked about her day, she gave me answers that felt rehearsed, polite, detached. Sarah was present, but she wasn't really there anymore. I remember the day I knew I couldn't shake the feeling. It was a Tuesday evening, typical as ever. We just finished dinner, and Sarah excused herself to check on some emails, retreating to the other side of the house. I sat in the living room, flipping through channels, but my mind was elsewhere. Her phone was on the counter, buzzing again. Unlocked. I shouldn't have looked, I knew that. But something in me, call it instinct, call it paranoia, pushed me toward the screen. Just a glance, I told myself. A single glance to put my mind at ease. Instead, it set my world on fire. The name on the screen, Paul, our neighbor. A man I'd had countless beers with, the one I trusted with spare keys to our house. The same man who'd helped us move furniture into the guest room last summer when we joked about how our lives had become suburban cliches. But what I saw wasn't a casual text. It wasn't just, hey, hope you're well. No, it was intimate. It was a conversation that spoke of late nights and promises I hadn't been a part of. I felt my stomach drop. The blood in my veins turned cold. I placed the phone back exactly as it was, forcing myself to breathe, to act like nothing was out of the ordinary. That's the thing about betrayal. It hits you like a quiet storm, unexpected, devastating, but so subtle at first that you almost miss its full impact. But I didn't miss it, not anymore. For days, I carried this knowledge with me like a curse. I watched her carefully, studying her movements, her words. She didn't know that I knew, and that gave me an advantage. But I needed more than just suspicion. I needed proof. And I wasn't going to confront her until I had every piece of this twisted puzzle in my hands. The days dragged on, and so did the excuses. She'd be home late, she said. Meetings ran over, or the gym session with her friends had gone long. Lies. Every word was a lie, and every time I heard one, the rage inside me grew. Not a hot, impulsive anger. No, this was cold. This was calculated. In the meantime, I started noticing more. Paul had been around a lot lately, too much. Dropping by with bottles of wine, stopping in for a quick chat that never felt quite so quick. His presence made my skin crawl, but I played my part, nodding along to his jokes, pretending nothing had changed. If he was going to betray me, I was going to let him think he had the upper hand. And Sarah? She was becoming a ghost in our own home. She'd touch me, but it felt mechanical. She'd laugh, but her eyes weren't with me. They were with him. Her body would lay next to mine at night, But the warmth was gone, replaced by a cold distance that stretched between us like an empty chasm. I didn't need to be a detective to know what was happening. I just needed to see it for myself. It was during one of those strained dinners when everything clicked. We sat across from each other, the candlelight flickering between us, casting shadows on the walls that seemed to mock the facade of our marriage. I asked her about work, about her day. Her answers were clipped, distracted. Her eyes flitted toward the clock, as if counting down the minutes until she could leave. For a second I saw it, her guilt. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. "I'm going to bed early," she said, standing up abruptly, leaving her half-eaten meal on the plate. I nodded, watching her go, my hands tightening around the edges of the table. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the distant hum of traffic outside. I stayed at the table, staring at the empty seat where she'd been. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to ask. The evidence was right in front of me, clear as day, but I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. That would be too easy. Instead, I started planning. I was no fool. I knew how to wait, how to bide my time. If I confronted her now, she'd deny everything. She'd twist it, gaslight me into thinking I was the one going crazy. No, I couldn't let that happen. This wasn't going to be a messy explosion of accusations and tears. It was going to be clean, precise, and I would be the one pulling the strings. The next morning, I got up early, before Sarah was awake. I moved through the house like a shadow, quiet and deliberate. Her phone sat on the nightstand next to the bed, and I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. There would be more opportunities to gather what I needed. I left the house that morning with one goal: to find out everything. The image of Sarah and Paul together, laughing behind my back, fueled me with focus I hadn't felt in years. There was no emotion in it anymore, just strategy. I wasn't going to let them tear my life apart. I would be the one to tear theirs apart, and I would do it without them ever seeing it coming. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm. The doubts were still there, lingering in the back of my mind like an old wound, but now they were accompanied by something else, a plan. And soon they would regret ever underestimating me. I spent the next few days watching them. It was subtle at first, Sarah's little gestures, the way her eyes lingered on Paul for just a beat too long when he came over to drop off another bottle of wine or borrow a tool. I'd known this man for years, shared beers with him, joked about the small absurdities of suburban life. But now every laugh we'd shared tasted bitter. I watched how their words curled around each other, a private dance of hidden meanings and coded glances. Their shared history, one I hadn't been a part of, was on full display if you knew where to look. And I was looking. Sarah had no idea I knew. She had no reason to suspect that her lies were starting to pile up, that the cracks in our marriage had been noticed. Her behavior was becoming more erratic, more absences, more unexplained work obligations, leaving me to spend the evenings alone while she was God knows where. I'd ask her how her day went, playing my role, and she'd give me the same vague answers. Barely meeting my eyes, I let her lies hang in the air, let her dig her own grave. But Paul, he was different. He wasn't trying as hard to hide it anymore. There was a casual arrogance about him, as if he believed that no matter what, I was too blind to see what was happening right in front of me. He'd drop by unannounced, his grin too wide, his handshake too firm, like he was testing me, gauging my ignorance. And for now, I let him think he was winning. But the cold certainty inside me was growing. Soon they'd both realize just how much I knew. And by then it would be far too late. Sarah had begun spending more time at Paul's house, making weak excuses that barely held together. "I'm just going over to help Emma with some things," she'd say. Emma, Paul's wife, seemed blissfully unaware, or at least that's what I assumed. But every time Sarah left, every time I watched her step out the door with that look of calm on her face, the rage inside me burned hotter. I started my own investigation. I knew better than to confront her without every piece of the puzzle, so I stayed silent, collecting information, piecing together the truth. At night, when she was asleep, I'd scroll through her phone, reading the messages between her and Paul, each one confirming my suspicions. It was all there in black and white. The late-night meetings, the secret plans, every dirty word they shared, every promise dripped with betrayal. But it wasn't enough. I wanted to hear it from them, needed to see it with my own eyes. So I began following them. It wasn't hard. Their arrogance made them careless, assuming I was too wrapped up in my own world to notice theirs. Sarah thought she had me fooled, but I trailed her one night when she said she was going to a friend's place. Instead, she went straight to Paul's house. I parked down the street, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched her knock on his door and slip inside. They were in there for hours. When she finally came home that night, I didn't ask. She didn't offer. It was becoming a routine now, the lies, the betrayal, the silent game we were playing. But I was the only one who knew the rules. I was the only one who understood how this game was going to end. The neighborhood barbecue came sooner than I expected. It was the perfect setting, a warm, breezy Saturday evening with neighbors gathering in Paul's backyard. The smell of grilled burgers filled the air, and the sounds of kids playing in the distance created an idyllic backdrop. But for me, this was the battleground. I could feel the tension building, but I had to play it cool. I had to wait. Sarah and Paul were there, as casual as ever. They moved around the yard separately, but there was a familiarity in their movements, a shared secret that only they thought they knew. I watched them, every glance, every time they got a little too close. I kept myself busy, chatting with neighbors, making small talk. But my mind was focused, laser sharp. The moment I'd been waiting for was coming. It happened near the grill. I was standing with a beer in hand talking to one of the neighbors when Paul approached. He had that same smug grin on his face, the one I had come to despise. He clapped me on the shoulder too hard and leaned in. I could smell the alcohol on his breath, and I knew he was feeling confident, like he'd already won. "Marcus, we should talk," Paul said, his voice low, like he was letting me in on some secret. I met his gaze, calm on the outside, but boiling on the inside. "Talk about what?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Paul glanced around, making sure no one was close enough to hear. He smirked, leaning in closer. "About Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "She and I, well, let's just say things have been happening between us for over a year now." There it was, the admission, the moment I'd been waiting for. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, but I kept my face neutral, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. "Is that so?" I said, taking a sip of my beer, as if he'd just told me about a new car he'd bought. Paul blinked, clearly taken aback by my calmness. "Yeah, man, she's carrying my kid now. She hasn't told you yet, has she?" I looked at him, my mind racing. His words were meant to destroy me, to break me apart, but instead they solidified my resolve. I set my beer down and leaned in just enough so only he could hear me. "Well, here's the thing, Paul," I said, my voice cold and measured. "While you've been busy with Sarah, I've been spending my evenings with Emma." The shock in Paul's eyes was instant, the color draining from his face. He hadn't seen that coming. "And guess what, Paul," I continued, enjoying every second of his disbelief. "Emma's pregnant with my child." Just as I finished speaking, Emma, who had been nearby, walked over. She had heard everything. Her face was calm, but I could see the glint in her eyes, the satisfaction of exposing the truth. She stepped up beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "It's true, Paul," Emma said, her voice steady. "I'm leaving you. I've already spoken to a lawyer." Paul stood there, stunned into silence, his jaw working but no words coming out. All around us, the barbecue had come to a standstill. Conversations had stopped, and I could feel the eyes of our neighbors on us. Everyone had heard. I watched Paul's face crumble, his carefully constructed world falling apart in front of everyone. Sarah, too, had frozen in place, realizing that her affair, her lies, had just been torn open for all to see. I glanced at her, but I didn't feel sympathy. I felt power. She had been careless, and now she was paying the price. The silence in the yard stretched on, thick with tension. Sarah's eyes met mine, wide and panicked, as if she was trying to find a way out of this, trying to salvage something. But there was nothing left to save. Paul's face was white, his confidence shattered. Without another word, I turned and walked away from the grill, leaving the chaos behind me. My heart was pounding, but I felt a strange calm wash over me. This was only the beginning. I had exposed them, ripped their lies out into the open, and now the real work would begin. Paul and Sarah had no idea what was coming next, but soon they would. I sat in the car after walking away from the barbecue, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. The shattered look on Paul's face, the wide-eyed panic in Sarah's, the whispers and stares from the neighbors, they all played in my head, a slow-motion replay of the chaos I'd just unleashed. For a moment, I let myself feel it, the anger, the betrayal, the cold satisfaction of seeing them crumble in public. But then it passed, like a wave that breaks on the shore and retreats, leaving nothing behind but a wet emptiness. I wasn't done, not by a long shot. The revenge at the barbecue had been impulsive, almost too easy. They deserved worse, much worse. As I drove home, the plan began to form. I would dismantle their lives piece by piece, slowly, methodically, until they had nothing left. No friends, no careers, no reputation. I wouldn't resort to violence. I didn't need to. I would destroy them in the one place they valued most, their image. The picture-perfect suburban couple, that illusion would be gone forever. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the plan was taking shape. I stepped into the house, the silence inside unsettling. Sarah wouldn't be home for a while. She'd have to deal with the fallout from the barbecue first, probably sit with Paul to figure out what had just happened. But I didn't care about her explanations or lies anymore. I had work to do. I went straight to the office, shutting the door behind me. The sound of the lock clicking into place was comforting, as if I'd just sealed myself in a fortress, untouchable. My computer blinked to life as I sat down, the bright screen illuminating the dark room. This wasn't going to be a simple revenge. I needed evidence, solid, undeniable proof of everything they had done, and I needed to gather it without raising suspicion. I started with Sarah's phone. She hadn't bothered to change her password, another sign of her arrogance. She believed I was oblivious, that I wouldn't dare snoop through her things. She was wrong. Within minutes, I was in, scrolling through her texts, her emails, her social media accounts. Every secret conversation with Paul, every plan to meet up, every explicit message they had exchanged over the last year, there it was, all laid out for me to see. But it wasn't enough. I needed more, something bigger. I moved on to the next phase, digging deeper. I needed to see where the money was going. Infidelity wasn't just about sex and lies. There was always a financial component, something they'd need to keep their secrets alive. I hacked into our joint bank account, scrolling through the transactions. That's when I saw it. Payments I hadn't authorized to places I didn't recognize, hotels, restaurants, stores I'd never set foot in. It was clear Sarah had been funneling money, using our savings to fund her little affair. The amounts weren't massive, but they added up, and there was a pattern. She'd been careful, making sure not to take too much at once, but over time, it had grown. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenched, fingers tightening around the mouse. The money wasn't just for them, it was for her. Something else was going on, something beyond the affair. I needed to find out what it was. I started pulling the records, printing them out, making copies. Evidence. I wasn't just going to ruin her reputation. I was going to bankrupt her. I spent the next few hours compiling everything. Texts, emails, bank statements. I made sure every piece was neatly organized, every detail in place. I was meticulous, methodical. There could be no gaps, no mistakes. When I was done, I had a small stack of papers that told the whole story of Sarah's betrayal. But there was still more work to be done. I wasn't finished yet. I logged into Paul's email. I'd managed to get his password months ago, during one of our friendly drinking nights. He drunkenly revealed it while showing me some photos, never imagining I'd use it against him. As I sifted through his inbox, I wasn't surprised to find dozens of emails from Sarah, most of them hidden under work-related subjects to avoid suspicion. They had been careful but not careful enough. What I did find surprised me, though. There were emails between Paul and his colleagues, several of them discussing promotions, deals, and even some side business ventures. But the tone was off. There were references to bonuses and favors that didn't sit right. It took me a few minutes to piece it together, but once I did, I realized Paul had been involved in something dirty at work, embezzling, or some form of fraud. Whatever it was, he'd been skimming money off the top for years, hiding it in shell companies, trusting his position in the company to shield him from scrutiny. I smiled. I hadn't expected this, but it was a gift. I now had two ways to ruin Paul. His affair with my wife was personal, but this was professional. If I played this right, I could destroy both his marriage and his career in one fell swoop. I spent the next week gathering more information, waiting for the perfect moment. Sarah acted like nothing had changed, still spinning her web of lies, still slipping out to meet Paul whenever she thought I wasn't paying attention. I didn't confront her, I let her think she was in control, but every time she left, I'd add another piece to the puzzle. Finally, I was ready. I'd been collecting data on Paul's work emails, his fraudulent activities, and the money Sarah had siphoned off. I had compiled a file so damning there was no way they could talk their way out of it, but I wasn't going to use it just yet. I needed one more thing, one more twist to ensure their downfall would be complete. I hired a private investigator, someone to follow Sarah and Paul, to get photographic evidence of their meetings, their affairs. I didn't want grainy screenshots or hacked texts. I needed something concrete, undeniable. And the investigator delivered. Photos of Sarah sneaking into Paul's office after hours, meeting him at a hotel across town. Images of them together, smiling like they had no care in the world. It was perfect. The final piece of the plan came unexpectedly. One evening, as I was going through Sarah's financial records again, I found another discrepancy. Larger this time. She had transferred money to an offshore account. A lot of money. It didn't make sense at first, until I realized she wasn't just hiding an affair. She was preparing to leave. She had been planning her escape, siphoning money slowly, building her way out. Maybe she'd intended to run away with Paul, or maybe she had her own plans. Either way, she was gearing up to vanish and take our money with her. I sat there staring at the numbers, the anger inside me turning into something colder, sharper. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. She was going to leave me, ruin me financially, and disappear. I couldn't let that happen. My plan had to shift. It was no longer just about humiliating her. It was about stopping her before she could destroy my life completely. I waited for her to leave the house that evening, some excuse about meeting friends for dinner. I didn't care. I grabbed her laptop, her files, anything I could use to access her accounts. Within an hour, I had locked her out of everything. Her bank accounts, her credit cards, her offshore account. All of it was frozen. She wouldn't be able to move a single dollar without my say. The feeling of power was intoxicating, but I wasn't done. The next morning, I sent everything I had gathered, every piece of incriminating evidence on Paul, to his company's board of directors. Emails, financial statements, pictures. I sent it anonymously, of course, making sure it couldn't be traced back to me. I didn't need them to know where it came from. I just needed them to know. By the end of the day, the news had broken. Paul had been fired, escorted out of the building under suspicion of fraud and embezzlement. The company was launching an internal investigation. His name was already being dragged through the mud, and the media was circling like vultures. Sarah was next. I confronted her that evening when she came home. She walked in the door, her smile fading the moment she saw me sitting in the living room, the stack of evidence laid out on the coffee table in front of me. "Marcus, what's going on?" she asked, her voice faltering. I looked at her, feeling nothing but cold detachment. You've been planning to leave, I said, holding up the bank records. I know everything, and you're not going anywhere. She stood there, frozen, her eyes wide with fear as I laid out everything. The affair, the money, her plans to vanish. I told her how I'd locked her out of everything, how she was trapped. I watched the panic spread across her face as she realized there was no escape. But I wasn't finished. And Paul, I said, leaning back in my chair, savoring the moment. He's done too. Fired. His career is over. Sarah sank into a chair, her hands trembling, tears welling in her eyes. But I didn't care. I had waited for this. I had planned every moment, and now they were both ruined. It wasn't over yet, though. There was still one more thing to do. The public exposure would come next, a final calculated move that would leave them with nothing. I watched her crumble before me, but I didn't feel triumph, just a hollow sense of victory, knowing I had won the battle, but at what cost? The next step in the plan had to be perfect. Sarah had already started acting strange, picking up on subtle shifts in our dynamic. She no longer moved around the house with the same careless ease. I could feel her watching me sometimes, searching my face for signs that I knew something. But I played my part well. I gave her nothing. No accusations, no questions, just quiet detachment. I had expected her to try to salvage what was left, to offer apologies, maybe even beg for forgiveness. But instead she leaned into her lies as if doubling down would somehow protect her from the inevitable. She started coming home earlier, offering shallow attempts at affection. Let's go out for dinner, she'd say, as if a night out could erase everything. I agreed, of course. I wasn't ready to strike yet. I had one more piece to set in motion before everything would fall apart for her. I began planting seeds of doubt between her and Paul. Their little relationship had grown on a foundation of deception and secrecy, but now I would turn it against them. It didn't take much. A few subtle changes in the way I looked at her, the way I responded to her texts when she claimed she was running late after work. I could feel the paranoia creeping in, and that's exactly what I wanted. Through her phone, I started sending anonymous messages to Paul, cryptic notes hinting at Sarah's unfaithfulness. Not to me, but to him. Paul, ever the insecure egomaniac, couldn't handle the idea that she might be betraying him the way they'd betrayed me. Within days, I saw it in their texts. Little barbs, mistrust, questions. Paul began to grow suspicious, accusing her of seeing someone else. Sarah's responses became defensive, her calm demeanor cracking. Meanwhile, I was setting the stage for the final act. I had begun sending out packets, carefully prepared documents with copies of emails, texts, and bank statements to key figures in Sarah's life, her workplace, her closest friends, even her family. I made sure the packets were sent anonymously, and I chose my targets carefully, knowing how much she valued the image of the perfect wife, the respectable professional. One by one, they would start to see the truth of who she really was. I didn't stop at Sarah. Paul's world was already crumbling with his dismissal from the company, but I wanted to make sure his reputation was irreparably damaged. I leaked the photos from my private investigator. Images of Paul and Sarah, intimate moments in places they shouldn't have been. Those photos found their way into the hands of key people in his social circle, business contacts, and even his wife, Emma. Emma had stayed quiet after the barbecue, keeping her distance, but this was too much for her. She filed for divorce, citing the affair as the final blow. With both of them reeling, it was time for the final confrontation. I invited Sarah to dinner one evening. We hadn't gone out in weeks, and she jumped at the chance, eager to smooth things over. She dressed carefully, her eyes scanning me for any signs of warmth, but I kept my distance, waiting for the right moment. We went to one of her favorite restaurants, a quiet spot that we used to visit before everything went to hell. She tried to make small talk, but I barely listened. My mind was focused on the end game. After dinner, as we drove home, I casually mentioned that I had invited a few neighbors over for drinks that evening. Her face paled slightly, but she recovered quickly, nodding in agreement. She didn't know what was coming. When we pulled into the driveway, I could already see the cars parked out front. Inside, Paul was waiting, along with a small group of our closest friends and neighbors, People who had known us for years, who had no idea what was about to unfold. We walked in and I could feel Sarah tense beside me as she saw the crowd gathered. Paul's face was tight with stress, the lines around his mouth deepening. He hadn't expected this. Sarah hadn't either. "Marcus, what's going on?" she whispered, her voice shaky. I ignored her, stepping into the center of the room. The air was thick with tension, the kind that hangs just before a storm. I cleared my throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I said, my voice steady. I wanted to clear the air. "There's been a lot going on behind the scenes, and I think it's time everyone knew the truth." Sarah's hand shot out, grabbing my arm. "Marcus, please don't," she whispered, her voice frantic. I pulled away from her, meeting her eyes with cold detachment. "It's too late for that." I walked over to the television and connected my laptop, pulling up a file I had prepared for this exact moment. The room fell silent as the screen flickered to life, revealing the first of many emails. Intimate conversations between Sarah and Paul, laying bare the extent of their affair. Gasps echoed around the room, the weight of the betrayal settling over everyone like a suffocating blanket. Sarah stood frozen, her face drained of color. Paul shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape, but there was none. I clicked through the evidence methodically, emails, photos, bank transactions. Every piece of their lies, their deceit, projected onto the screen for all to see. Each revelation was a nail in the coffin of their reputations. "Sarah, Paul," I said, turning to them, "I've known about your affair for months. I've known about the money you siphoned, Sarah, the lies you both told. And now so does everyone else." Sarah tried to speak, her lips moving silently, but no words came out. Paul, for all his bravado, looked like a deer caught in headlights. He opened his mouth to say something, but I cut him off with a single look. "And Paul, in case you think this is just about your affair, everyone knows about the fraud you committed at work. It's over for you." The room was dead silent. The neighbors stared wide-eyed at the spectacle unfolding before them. I could see the judgment in their eyes, the whispers already starting to form. Sarah and Paul had no way out of this. No more lies, no more secrets. I walked to the door, my heart pounding with the adrenaline of victory. I had done it. They were ruined. Their perfect little worlds, their reputations, shattered. But as I reached for the door, a strange feeling washed over me. The satisfaction I had expected, the sense of closure, it wasn't there. I looked back at the room, at the destruction I had wrought, and for a moment I felt hollow, empty. Sarah was crumpled in a chair, her face in her hands. Paul stood in the corner, his fists clenched, his world collapsing around him. The neighbors, once so friendly and full of polite smiles, now looked at them with disgust, as if they had become something less than human. I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt powerful. But all I felt was the weight of everything that had happened. Revenge hadn't given me what I thought it would. It hadn't healed me. I stood there for a long time, staring at the night sky, wondering what came next. The aftermath would be messy. Sarah and Paul were finished, but what did that leave me with? Emma had already left Paul, and while she had reached out a few times, I wasn't sure if I wanted to rebuild anything with her. The revenge had consumed me, and now that it was over, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I knew one thing, though. Sarah was gone from my life for good. She'd be humiliated, ostracized, left with nothing. I had made sure of that. But in destroying her, I had lost something in myself, too. The anger, the need for retribution, had carved out a part of me I wasn't sure I could get back. I walked down the street, away from the house, away from the wreckage I had created. The night was quiet, but inside I felt the storm brewing, the emotional fallout that would come next. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here anymore. This place, this life, it was all poison now, and there was no going back. I had won, but at what cost? The evening of the confrontation had arrived, and everything was in place. I watched from the window as Sarah, Paul, and the others arrived one by one, parking their cars along the street. They entered the house, unaware of the storm brewing inside. Each step they took, each smile they exchanged, felt like a ticking clock counting down to the moment everything would collapse. I had invited them all under the guise of reconciliation, a final attempt to repair the fractured relationships and clear the air. But there would be no healing tonight. This wasn't a night for apologies or half-truths. It was a reckoning, and I was ready to deliver it. I paced the room, every movement calculated. I had rehearsed this in my mind 1,000 times, picturing the looks on their faces, the gasps of horror as they realized just how deep the betrayal ran. I had spent weeks preparing, gathering every piece of evidence, setting every trap. Tonight, it all came together. Sarah was already seated at the dining table, her eyes darting nervously between the guests as if she could sense that something wasn't right. Paul sat beside her, stiff, his jaw clenched. He hadn't spoken much since he arrived. Maybe he felt it too, the tension in the air, the weight of secrets pressing down on us all. Or maybe he was just waiting for his moment to come out on top, to turn the tables. Either way, I had made sure he wouldn't get the chance. I walked into the room, drawing their attention, and the conversations quieted. Sarah looked at me with an almost hopeful smile, as though this dinner might be her chance to explain everything, to smooth it over. But the smile faltered when she saw the expression on my face. I cleared my throat, forcing a calmness into my voice that I didn't feel. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I know it's been a difficult few months, and there's been a lot left unsaid. But tonight, I think it's time we all face the truth. Paul shifted in his seat, and Sarah's eyes widened slightly, her hand reaching for her wineglass. The others, our neighbors and friends, looked confused but curious, sensing the weight in my words. This wasn't going to be a casual evening. I walked over to the large television I had set up in the living room, a laptop already connected. "There's something I've been holding back," I said, glancing at Sarah and Paul. "But I think it's time we all see it." I clicked the remote, and the screen came to life with the first image, a photo of Sarah and Paul taken by the private investigator. They were outside a hotel, their bodies close, laughing, completely oblivious to the world around them. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the room as people leaned forward, straining to see the images flashing across the screen. Sarah stood abruptly, knocking her chair back. "Marcus, what are you doing?" Her voice wavered, panic rising as she realized what was happening. This isn't what it looks like." I didn't respond, letting the next image speak for itself. Another shot, this time of them entering the hotel room together. The timestamp was clear, and any hope Sarah had of explaining away the first image evaporated. The room buzzed with whispered accusations, shocked glances bouncing between Sarah and Paul. Paul's face was pale, his mouth hanging open in stunned silence. I took a step closer to Sarah, my voice low but steady. "For over a year, you've been lying to me. Sneaking around, pretending everything was fine while you and Paul were playing your little game behind my back." She shook her head, her eyes wide and pleading. "It's not like that." "Save it," I interrupted, my tone cold. "You've already been exposed. Everyone here can see the truth." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with disbelief and judgment. I turned to Paul, who was still frozen in his seat, his fists clenched. "And you," I said, my voice filled with the venom I'd been holding back. "You thought you could get away with this, that I wouldn't find out, but it's all here, Paul. Every lie, every betrayal." I clicked the remote again, and this time the screen filled with emails, dozens of them. Emails between Paul and Sarah, carefully labeled under false work subjects, but the content left nothing to the imagination. They had planned it all, the meetings, the excuses, even the stories they would tell their spouses to cover their tracks. The murmurs in the room grew louder, the whispers of disgust and outrage building into a roar. Paul stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he growled, his face flushed with anger. "This is a private matter." "You have no right." "No right?" I snapped, cutting him off. "You destroyed my marriage. You lied to your wife, to everyone in this room. Don't talk to me about rights, Paul." Sarah was crying now, her hands covering her face as the weight of the exposure crashed down on her. But I wasn't done. I clicked the remote one last time and the final piece of evidence filled the screen. Financial records. Sarah's secret offshore account. The money she had been siphoning from our joint account to fund her future with Paul. Every transaction was there, laid out in black and white, undeniable proof of her betrayal, not just emotionally but financially. The room was dead silent now, the full weight of the truth pressing down on everyone. Sarah's sobs were the only sound, muffled and broken. "I know everything," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Every lie you told, every dollar you stole, every time you betrayed me." Sarah collapsed into her chair, her body trembling with sobs. Paul stood there, his fists clenched, fury radiating off him, but he didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. I turned to the room, addressing everyone. This is what happens when people think they can live double lives, when they think they can get away with betraying the people who trust them. But secrets don't stay hidden forever. I looked at Sarah one last time, her tear-streaked face staring up at me, a mixture of devastation and pleading in her eyes. But I felt nothing, no pity, no sympathy, just cold detachment. I had given her every chance to come clean, to make things right, and she had chosen lies every time. Now the consequences were hers to face. I glanced around the room, seeing the shock on everyone's faces, the realization that their picture-perfect view of our neighborhood was shattered. I knew the gossip would spread like wildfire, that Sarah and Paul's reputations would never recover. I had delivered my revenge, and it had been devastating. But as I stood there looking at the wreckage I had created, a strange emptiness settled over me. I had won. I had exposed them, destroyed them in front of everyone they cared about, yet the satisfaction I had imagined was absent. The victory felt hollow, like an echo that had lost its power. I stepped away from the television, the room still filled with the weight of what had been revealed. "I think we're done here," I said quietly, turning to the door. "There's nothing left to say." I didn't wait for anyone to respond. I walked out, leaving the broken pieces of our lives behind me. The night air was cold against my skin, but it didn't feel refreshing. It felt like a reminder that there was no turning back from what I had done. I had orchestrated the perfect revenge, ruined them both without ever raising my voice. But at what cost? As I walked down the street, the realization hit me with brutal clarity. In destroying them, I had destroyed something in myself too. I had won, but I had lost more than I could have ever imagined. I stood at the edge of the neighborhood, the familiar houses stretching out before me like monuments to a life I no longer recognized. The street was quiet, eerily so, as though the world itself had drawn its breath, waiting for something, anything, to shatter the silence. But there was nothing left to break. I had done that already. The wreckage of what had once been my life lay behind me. Sarah's reputation was in ruins, Paul's career and marriage had crumbled, and Emma, sweet, innocent Emma, had left Paul for good. She had even reached out to me in the days following the dinner, offering words of comfort, as though we could salvage something from the mess. But I hadn't answered her calls. I wasn't sure I wanted to. I wasn't sure I could. I had spent months planning my revenge, crafting every detail, ensuring there would be no escape for Sarah or Paul, and it had worked. I had won. But as I stood there staring out at the quiet street, I couldn't shake the gnawing emptiness that had settled deep inside me. I thought back to the confrontation, the way their faces had crumpled, the way the room had turned on them. The satisfaction I had expected to feel had been fleeting, replaced by something colder. I had set out to ruin them, to make them feel the full weight of their betrayal, and I had done it. But it hadn't brought me peace. If anything, it had only deepened the hollow ache inside me. The days following the dinner had been a blur. Sarah had tried to reach out, leaving voicemails filled with sobs and apologies, but I had ignored them. She had nothing left to say that I wanted to hear. Her life, like mine, was now irreparably broken. I had seen her a few times since, her once proud figure, now hunched, her face drawn and pale. She avoided the neighbors, knowing they whispered about her, about the scandal I had exposed. She was a pariah now, and I was the one who had made her that way. But what had it really cost me? I had destroyed Sarah, but in doing so, I had destroyed the part of me that had once loved her. I had spent years building a life with her, trusting her, and when that trust had shattered, I hadn't just lost her, I had lost myself. The rage that had fueled me, that had driven me to orchestrate my revenge, had consumed me, leaving nothing behind but a shell. And now, standing here, looking out at the neighborhood that had once been my sanctuary, I wondered if I had ever really known who I was without her. The phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Emma again. I stared at the screen, her name glowing in the darkness. For a moment, I considered answering, letting her voice pull me out of the void I was sinking into. She had been a victim too, betrayed by the man she had trusted, just as I had been. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of trying to build something new with her felt like trying to rebuild a house from the ashes of a fire. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, turning away from the street and walking toward my house. The silence inside was oppressive, the air thick with memories I no longer wanted. I wandered through the rooms, feeling like a stranger in my own home. The photos on the walls, of Sarah and me smiling, of vacations and holidays, felt like relics from another life, one that had been erased in a single brutal night. I sat down in the living room staring at the spot where I had stood during the dinner, where I had laid out every piece of evidence, where I had watched Sarah and Paul crumble under the weight of their own lies. It felt so distant now, like a scene from a movie I had watched too many times, the details blurring with each replay. Revenge hadn't healed me. It hadn't brought me the closure I had been so desperate for. Instead, it had left me more broken, more lost than I had ever been before. I had thought that by exposing Sarah and Paul, I would somehow reclaim control over my life, that I would feel empowered, freed from the weight of their betrayal. But now, with the dust settled, I realized that the damage wasn't just external. It was internal, festering like an infection that couldn't be cured by revenge. The truth was, I didn't know what came next. Moving forward seemed impossible, like trying to walk with broken legs. But staying here in this house, in this neighborhood that had been tainted by everything that had happened, was equally unbearable. Every corner of it reminded me of what I had lost, of what I had become. As the days passed, I started to pack. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, just small things, items I didn't want to look at anymore. But soon the boxes piled up, and the house began to feel less like home and more like a mausoleum, a place where the ghosts of my past haunted every room. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here. The neighborhood had become a prison, the memories suffocating, the whispers of the neighbors, the pitying glances, they had started to wear me down. I needed a fresh start, somewhere far from the wreckage of this life. Emma had offered me a way out. She had suggested we leave together, start over somewhere new, but I had declined. She had meant well, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure I ever would be. Whatever we had shared, whatever bond had formed between us in the wake of our mutual betrayal, felt tainted by the bitterness of what had happened. It wasn't something I could build a future on. As I packed the last of my things, I paused by the front door, my hand resting on the doorknob. I looked around the house one last time, taking in the emptiness, the quiet. This had been my life once. But that life was gone now, torn apart by lies and revenge. And maybe in leaving, I could finally start to let go of the weight I had been carrying for so long. I stepped outside, the cool air hitting my face as I locked the door behind me. It felt final, like closing a chapter I had spent too long reading. I walked to the edge of the driveway, the boxes piled in the back of my car, and glanced back at the house one last time. The street was still quiet, the neighbors' houses bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. For a moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia, a brief flicker of what had once been. But it was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by the cold reality of what my life had become. I climbed into the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I stared out at the road ahead. I didn't know where it would lead me, didn't know if I would ever find peace. But I knew I had to keep moving, had to leave this place behind if I ever wanted a chance at healing. As I pulled away, I felt the weight begin to lift, slowly, like a fog clearing after a long, dark night. The road stretched out before me, endless and uncertain, but for the first time in months, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. I had won the battle, but the war inside me wasn't over. Maybe it never would be. But as I drove into the night, leaving the neighborhood, the house, the wreckage of my old life behind, I allowed myself to believe, just for a moment, that there might be something better waiting for me on the other side.